and welcome to this week's episode of the Maine Challenge. So we have just wrapped up the second session of the 130th Legislature. We've just had the Republican and the Democratic conventions where they gather all their folks to get people elected. And it really makes me think about the structure of our legislature. So we say we have a citizen legislature and that we are in a representative democracy. But do we really? And does how we actually pay and the kind of benefits or schedules or lack of them that we have for our legislature, does that impact who can actually run and who can actually serve? We've done a good job of making sure that anyone can run with clean elections, but can anyone actually serve? And does who serves then impact the kinds of policies and what gets attention in our legislature? That's what this show is all about. But before we start talking to some of our amazing guests, let me just give you a few facts. So in the legislature, the first session of the first year of this legislature is 6 months long. And for that, legislators get paid $14,000. And in the second session, it's 4 months long. And for that, they get paid less than $10,000. So and that's just the time that they're in Augusta. That doesn't count all the meetings that they go to, the constituents, and it's a full-time, more than full-time job for which they are getting paid less than minimum wage, less than poverty wages. And so what does that mean? So who can afford to actually serve, even if you want so much to help the state of Maine and have so much to offer? Well, Dan Newman of the Maine Beacon put together some interesting statistics. One is that over half of our legislature, or close to half of our legislature, is either self-employed or own their own business. So that's a specific kind of person because most people can't get their employers to let them take 6 months off their job or 4 months off their job. Almost over a quarter of them are retired or semi-retired. And if you take the largest employing sectors of our economy, hospitality, healthcare support, daycare, and retail, right, that makes up most of our economy, there are only 12 legislators out of 186 who actually serve in those professions and have those kind of jobs. So, when we look at the policies, and if we look at representative and who's at the table, right, we're not necessarily focusing on the things that all working Mainers are focusing on because those people can't afford to be there. So what is that tension between a not wanting professional politicians who just make a living out of being a politician and a representative democracy in which we have people who look like Maine? And does what we pay them affect it, and how we structure our legislature, does that all work? How does that work? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we have wonderful conversations with someone who actually was going to run and turned out they couldn't afford to do it, with two people who recruit people to run and what kind of barriers they run into, and then with someone from the League of Women Voters who talks with me about the systemic need for change and changing maybe the entire ecosystem, she called it, of the state legislature. So this is a really interesting one. It's a thing we don't talk about enough because it really has long-range impacts for the kinds of policies that determine the kinds of things that we can and can't do in our lives. So it's a really important one. Stay tuned. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Mariah. This is Mariah Geer, who is an advocate with Maine Equal Justice. I think we met when you were a social work student and had come and had overcome many, many obstacles just to be able to do that. Tell us a little bit about your passion and why you care so much about making sure that the voices of people that are low income, people who are single moms, why it's so important, you think, for them to be heard and be there.
For one thing, I've been through a lot. I was a single homeless mom. I lived in the battered woman shelter, and I had to kind of take a step back and look at my life and figure out, how do I change things? How do I build a better life for them? Mm-hmm. I think that any time that we have an experience, we should be able to take something from that. And for me, I love to take something from it and use it to make sure that other people who are going through similar things have a better time, have an easier time than I did, have a person to light the way and show them that there's a path that they can take. As far as being able to go to the legislature and make that difference there, to me, that just makes the most sense, right? We talk about macro work, this kind of big picture umbrella systemic work. There are so many people out there who are experiencing the same thing that I'm missing.
Yeah.
right? And so what I really want to do, what I really would love to see is to see those big picture changes, those macro systemic changes, so that those changes impact all those people that I'm currently missing in the work that I'm able to do today.
So I know you went through a training program to learn how to run for office. And in Maine, we've sort of done a good job of clean elections so that you don't have to be wealthy to run. You can actually, get public financing to run. But then there's the reality of actually serving. So when you looked at that picture of what logistically it was going to look like, what were the barriers that you saw structurally for you once you got there?
So the biggest barrier really is financial. It's financial and time, right? So if I had endless time, I could work a full-time job and meet our financial needs and serve in the legislature. But nobody has endless time. And if I had the finances, I wouldn't have to worry about the time as much, and I could devote the time that's really, really needed to serving at the legislature. When you serve in the legislature, you have to put in a lot of time. You have to put in a lot of work. The amount of time that we see them there in hearings and in the building is only a small percentage of the time that's really required of doing that work. And if I were going to do it, I would want to do it well. Yes. I would want to show up and I would be there 100%. Realistically, for me, it's just not possible to do both at the same time. And I can't financially leave my job to go serve.
Because people from your similar circumstances, from people who don't have money, people who don't have savings, people who don't back up, people who can't work two jobs, how do you think that impacts the kind of policies, the macro policies that you're talking about that you want to influence?
I love our legislators. I know very many of them. They're really wonderful, amazing people, and they do bring lots of different perspectives that are really helpful and useful in the work that we do. But most of them do not bring that poverty, that the having lived in poverty perspective. And so when they create those policies, there's really good intentions, but they're often a little short-sighted. They're often not thinking about the escalating consequences that could come from changing a policy here and a policy there. And for those of us who've lived in that, we would go, oh, wait, but if you do that, then this is going to happen to my other thing that I also depend on that's really, really important. And then what? And then the floor drops out from underneath people. So there's just so many reasons why it just makes sense to have people there who, reflect this broader viewpoint, broader experience. I also think that it's really valuable to have, we have some really wonderful social workers who serve. Mm-hmm. I would love to serve because I'm a social worker. I think social workers bring some incredible skills to the legislature. I always love to throw that in because I know a lot of social workers who've never thought about themselves as serving. So if any social workers listen to this, I want you to think you have some incredible skills: mediation, communication, macro, micro, being able to say the big picture and the little picture, but together at the same time. There's so many social work skills that come to
listening,
play.
Just listening. That's a good social work skill.
Totally, yes. And you actually listen to the person instead of listening for what I'm going to say next. Listen where they're actually coming from and what they're talking about. And
we're losing out on the voices of a whole swaths of people who just don't fit one of the categories: retired or independently wealthy, or a spouse that supports them, or whatever that makes it possible to do it. And so this idea that we're a citizen legislature is really noble, and I think it's a good thing.
It's amazing, but also it's not real. If we could really help the citizens of Maine understand just how much work is going in and just how little the people who are doing the work are getting paid, and just how few of their voices are actually being represented, I think that could happen. But I think that this is just something that most people don't know about, don't think about, don't realize.
And that's why we're doing this show.
Yes. So that we can thank you so much.
Exactly. Well, no, and just say, we value public service, and if we value it, we have to compensate it so that everyone can participate, so that we can have a truly representative legislature, so we can have the voices of really important people like you, not just advocating, but actually at the table.
Absolutely.
Mariah, thank you so much for sharing your story and your passion. And we just have to keep talking about this, and we'll fix it.
That's good. Thank you so much, Betsy.
That's all right. We are so happy to welcome today to the program Ashley Mccurry, who is the Executive Director of Emerge Maine. Tell us a little bit first about what Emerge does and your mission and why you're so excited about it.
Emerge has been around for 16 years here in Maine. We train Democratic women to run for office with a 70-hour training program. But in addition to learning the nuts and bolts of how to run campaigns, we also provide a network of women that have come through the program, allied women and men that have trained in the program, led the program, that are all committed to increasing the number of Democratic women at all levels of government. One of the reasons it's so important is I think we have a lot of women that maybe are going to be great leaders. They're compassionate leaders. They're smart, driven, empathetic leaders. And they might not be the leaders that openly consider themselves a candidate for public office. So it can take maybe a friend, a network, maybe a spouse to say, hey, you really care about the community. Maybe you should consider running for school board, running for state house, running for the legislature, running for city council. And it actually, we used to run a statistic that you had to ask a woman 7 times to run for office. We don't think it takes as many times now, but we have great leaders that wouldn't consider running for office maybe without the tools, without the nudge, without the way to formulate the campaign. So we hope to break it down and make it more accessible for more women.
That's awesome. No, it's so great. And you have been incredibly successful. And Maine now is one of the top states in the nation in terms of the number of women. We are at, I think, 47% now. And so I want to talk about the women who don't run and who decide not to run, and particularly around the state legislature, because as you have said, it's so important to have people at the table. Talk to me a little bit about women who come into the program and are excited and want to run for the legislature, and then hear what the reality of the actual structure is and what happens then.
Yeah, we do have a lot of women that come into the program and are really bummed when they realize the commitment that it takes to be in the legislature. Firstly, you have to be there on session days. You have to be there during committee work. Of course, that's when the people's work is being done. And so it's really hard to find those flexible jobs with bosses that will allow you a really flexible work experience where you're gone, right, for really long hours, many days a week. Mm-hmm. There's also the flexibility of like going to the campaigns, working the events, going to the rooms, being in the community. That's all not counted when you're thinking of public service, right? That's all the work that you have to do to be a good legislator, but it is not counted in when you're thinking of the rate of pay and what legislators have to do. That's not the work that happens in Augusta. So there's certainly a lot of women who realize, okay, how am I going to make this work with a full-time job? If women are maybe the breadwinners of their families, they might be younger women, might be paying off their loans, paying off their debts, or trying to be in the years where they're supposed to earn, where they're kind of building that earning power. For them to take a step back from their career to do the public service work of running for office and serving in the legislature, they're taking a giant pay cut. And for women in their 30s, that might be exactly the same time frame where they're trying to build a name for themselves and a reputation in their career outside of public service.
Stop for 1 second. Just the wages, like it's not even minimum wage, right? I mean, and any legislator that we talk to, as you said, there's the campaigning, which is totally uncompensated. And then there is the actual job, which is not just the hours you're in the legislature, but you are doing constituent calls. And as you said, you have to go to the community events, you have to be in your community. So it's really more than a full-time job for way less than minimum wage. Like this is your only source of income. I mean, it's not possible. It's not possible to live on that source of income. So it really does make it awful. Okay, so now...
Well, I also am thinking about families, right? We're talking about these numbers. It's not possible to live that way as a single person, let alone, like I said, if you are someone who's feeding family members and trying to provide for children and spouses at that same capacity.
So let's talk about the other structural things. So childcare, lack of childcare.
Yeah, lack of childcare is a huge barrier for women running for office, right? You can campaign with a kid in a stroller, sure. You can knock on doors with a child in a stroller. But the reality is it's very hard in those hours to knock on doors and talk to voters when you're trying to navigate how to feed the kids and which day to feed the kids and how that works. Many people have really supportive spouses and partners. Fantastic. We love family campaigning is the reality, but not everybody has that flexibility. Like I said, not everybody is married to a high earning partner who is able to either sponsor or pay for a nanny, right? We want real people with genuine experiences, and real Mainers are trying to balance the needs of paying their bills, feeding their kids, and getting out the door and having some sort of semblance of a happy life.
That really skews. Like, I think the statistic is that over half of the legislature are either business owners or entrepreneurs, or are not the primary breadwinner for their family. How does that play out as you see it in terms of issues that affect women and families?
Well, the biggest issue that we talk about is through paid family leave. We talk a lot about how to support parents and families when they need to do the caretaking work. We're talking about the people most affected by social services not being able to be at the table to talk about how those social services would help them. We talk about people with part-time jobs, people affected by underemployment and unemployment, not really being able to have their voice heard in any of these votes. They're not even, think about how busy people are. They may not even be able to lobby at the state house. They may not have the time to be reaching out. So just realizing who's not at the table and making sure that we're removing those barriers as best we can. At Emerge, we try to make tuition free. We try to make sure folks are fundraising for their tuition so cost isn't a barrier. That's just one way. But the reality is, increasing pay would probably be a significant a way to bring more people to the table in politics. And I know it's a hard conversation to have. So
if we look at our economy in Maine, 200,000 people in our economy are in retail and healthcare and allied helping professions in the hospitality industry, right? So that's a huge chunk of Maine's population. And yet only 12 legislators out of 186 say that they're in those professions. And yet it's considered such political suicide, or, to say, oh yeah, people should have more, pay, or they should get more than $16,000 a year to be in office.
I think every time women legislators and all legislators share what they're doing and the amount of hours, I think most people don't realize how many hours it takes to be a legislator. I think people don't realize the amount of work that it is to actually be present and be available to all of their constituents. And it's such important work, right? It's a public service to our community. You need people to step up and take the time to learn the issues, to talk with people, to organize people, and to make sure that we're making policies that make people's lives better. You need people to step up and do that work. But if all the people who are smart and want to make money, right, are in other professions, well, then are you getting the top talent, the most critical thinkers, the most thoughtful listeners to the table every time? You can't be, right? We can't be. It's impossible.
I'm hoping that the Emerge graduates, and whether they run for office or they don't, as well as all of us, can raise our voices and say, we need to figure out a tipping point here where it allows everyday working families, working moms, ability to have their voice heard. And I am so grateful, Ashley, for all the work that Emerge does in recruiting amazing women to run at all levels of government. Because, the Dalai Lama says it's Western women who are going to save the world, and it's our time.
Our time.
So thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We are pleased to have with us today the director of the House Democratic Campaign Committee, Sean Smith. Sean, welcome, and thanks for being with us.
Hi, Betsy. Great to be here.
So, Sean, I know you have many, many duties in your position, but one of them is to help with recruiting candidates and helping people decide whether or not they can serve and, can they actually make this work in their life. We've been talking during the show about how difficult it is. We made it easier sort of to run with ranked choice voting and with clean elections, but serving is a whole other thing. And it's structured to be a citizen legislature, and that's awesome. That's something I think we all want and care about. But the amount of money that we pay or don't pay, and the hours and the flexibility or lack of flexibility. So talk to us a little bit about how that factors in as you and others go to recruit candidates.
Yeah, and recruiting candidates and finding the right candidates to run in these 151 House districts, it's by far the most important thing we do. Finding the right candidate who can fit the district, who can resonate with voters, who can put in the effort to knock on doors. It really makes the difference, because in these districts, you have 6,000 or 7,000 registered voters. So finding the right people, it means everything. And it's often the case when we go into a district and we work with a lot of folks on the ground and who are there locally, that we can find people who would be great candidates and be great legislators, but finding people who can also make it work professionally, financially, make it work with their family. That is the challenge. And, as you said, it's set up to be a citizen legislature. Legislators don't get paid very much. I think it's about $25,000 over the 2 years. There are benefits, there are per diems, but oftentimes, it can be long hours. You have to be there, especially at the end of session. Maine, as you know, is a big rural state. So unless you live in the Augusta Central Maine region, it's really tough to sometimes make it work.
If we look at the numbers actually in the legislature, it's pretty skewed, right? Mostly it's entrepreneurs or self-employed people. More than a quarter of it is retired people. There's some people who are who have a spouse who can support them. And there's others. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is that if you look at what is most of our workforce, which is in retail, hospitality and tourism, healthcare helpers, and childcare, that's the bulk of our workers. There's only 12 legislators out of 186, if you include the Senate, who work in those industries. Yeah. And so when we talk about a representative or a citizen legislature, how do you think that skews like what they talk about or the policies that they pass? What impact do you think it has once we get there?
Yeah, I certainly think, people's lived experiences certainly affect the legislation that they advocate for, how they vote. Certainly. And I think that's why we go to great lengths to try to find a lot of those folks and to make it work. But certainly, if you're a teacher or if you're a childcare worker or it's really tough. If you have to be in a certain place from 9 to 5 every single day and can't really take time off, it's very tough to serve.
Sean, do you have in your memory, seared in your memory, like people who were like the perfect candidate and they would be such a great rep, but they just couldn't make it work, or people who you thought were great and who tried it for 2 years and then said, "I'm out. I just can't do this"?
Yeah, of course. I think that there are, look, we recruit. I think this year we had to find 90 new candidates, and that's not atypical. So it's so many people. And like you said, it's a part-time legislature. It's not, you don't have professional politicians. People aren't doing this. So, when you have 85 or 93 Democratic incumbents, certainly you're going to find people that, their life changes or their professional situation changes, their family situations change, they move, and they can't do it for as long as they want. And certainly there are lots of examples of folks who would be amazing candidates and amazing legislators, and they just, even though they want to serve, they just can't figure out how to do it. And it's difficult to figure that out. And so there are so many stories of people that just can't figure out how to do it, but there are also a lot of stories of people who are able to figure out, and I think legislative leadership and staff really tries to bend over backwards to make it work for people.
To make it work. So that's a great segue into my last question, which is so many people do make it work, and they do it because they believe in public service, and they all want to make Maine a better place, and it's amazing, and yet in the public, in the outside world, politicians have gotten such a bad name, and it's sort of it's changed so much in the 40 years I've been there from being this like position on a pedestal to being this undignified thing. So given where people are and given what we know about the sacrifice and the public service, do you think there is a pathway, any kind of pathway that changes the amount that we pay? We haven't even kept up with inflation, just for even the very little bit. There was a study that came out that said it should at least be 32,000 instead of 24. But do you see any pathway for significant change to walk that line to say, yes, we're a citizen legislature and people need to be able to make enough money to be able to serve? Is there a pathway there, or is it just too politically impossible?
I don't know. I think it's a tough time to serve right now. I don't think anybody gets into the Maine legislature to make money. Everybody makes a huge sacrifice, but we certainly have to make it work for people. We certainly don't want people making huge sacrifices and then on top of that, losing money. People lose money at their jobs because they take time off. And so I think we do all have to work together. And I think that this should be a bipartisan issue, just to make it work for people. So, all different people, can serve. I think it's such an important, I think it's very important to have a cross-section of Maine serving in Augusta. I think that's what we all want.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do and for getting folks, those incredible people who serve and do public service despite how tough it can be once you get there. So I really appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that you do, Sean. Thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Betsy.
We are so grateful to have with us someone who knows a thing or two about the legislature and the structural issues in the legislature, Anna Keller, who is the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. Anna, thanks for joining us today on Maine Challenge.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So there seems to be this little point of tension between having a citizen legislature. So we don't want professional politicians. We don't want people who make a career out of, sitting in Washington forever or in Augusta forever. And yet, because we pay so little and because we have the way it works, only certain people can run. And so there's whole swaths of people who are low income or people who have a 9-to-5 job or who can't serve. So what do you make of that tension between those two different goals?
Our legislature, like most, definitely skews toward people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, for example. Mm-hmm. And there are, I think, both economic and philosophical challenges to having a more representative legislature. So, like you mentioned, the economic challenge that the legislature does not pay enough for you to live on, and yet it's really hard to have a full-time job and serve in the legislature. And we think a lot about the importance, for example, of clean elections and that you can afford to run. Right. But if you can afford to run, but you can't afford to serve, that doesn't get you very far.
Right, exactly. Here's the challenge, and you've dealt with this before. The people who got there are making it work somehow, most of them. Mm-hmm. And so their impetus to change it is very little. Do you see any path forward, Anna, about fixing this?
We usually look to citizen initiatives as our check and balance there. And I think that in Maine, the only way that I could see us making significant structural change to the legislature would be through some kind of a citizen initiative. And yet, many of the changes that we might consider as part of a bigger package might be constitutional amendments, for example, and then there's an even higher barrier because you wouldn't need that to raise the salaries. But if we were to think about moving toward a legislature that was a full-time legislature, or, for example, a legislature that had greater staff support for our legislators, greater ability for them to have policy analysis and those sort of things, that is another piece. I think of them being effectively able to do their jobs and not as dependent on lobbyists. That there's quite a few, this is an ecosystem of thinking, well, how do we make a legislature that is representative, A, and good at doing their jobs, B?
I love that you called it a legislative ecosystem, because that seems to be like, maybe we need like a whole Green New Deal for this legislative ecosystem where, one thing that I've thought about is like the whole idea of making it a smaller legislature, but so we use the same amount of money, but that the fewer people get it so that they can actually do what you said. We can have a much more representative group of people.
There's a mindset shift. I'm not sure how we get there, but I think it's not just on politicians to be doing better.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to have to come from us. And I think what you said is we respect them as doing public service, and then we have to compensate them at a way that people can participate, because otherwise young people, low income people, working people who work 40 hours a week for an employer who can't give them up for 6 months, they just don't get represented. And we know how important it is to have a seat at the table. So not just have people who care about you, but actually be at the table yourselves. And that's something that we are going to all have to work on together, I think. So thanks for joining us for this episode. This issue is something that we really don't talk about very much, but it's really important because it impacts who can serve, and it impacts the policies that happen, which impacts your life and my life. So this challenge for this week is for us to talk about this issue, talk about how much we value our legislators, and are we willing to pay them? Are we willing to make it work for regular working class people, for regular folks who have regular jobs, and not people who are all living in special circumstances or are just supreme sacrificers and willing to give up almost everything to do this? So it's just a great conversation. We need to talk about it more, and that's our challenge. Thanks for joining us, and please Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and go to our YouTube channel to find any back episodes of the Maine Challenge and our Sounds Off that you might have missed. Thanks so much.